Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 185 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Who should determine our culture and the morals our society follows? Who should model how we should dress, how we should eat and interact in public, where and how we should worship and how we should speak? Culture, or the intellectual achievements, attitudes, and behaviors of our particular places and social groups, is all around us. Culture impacts how we think and act as members of families, local communities, states, and even nations. Culture is really important. So, how do we establish it? Who sets these unwritten social rules and ideas that we adopt and live by? Joyce Goodfriend, a professor of history at the University of Denver, is curious about these questions too, and she set out to answer them in her latest book, Who Should Rule at Home? Confronting the Elite in British New York City. Now, to answer these questions for early New York City, Joyce found that she had to look at how the culture of the city evolved between 1664 and 1776, a period of great cultural change for New Yorkers, because this is the period where New Yorkers transitioned from being Dutch to English, and they had to negotiate what their cultural identity as English subjects would be. So, as Joyce takes us through the establishment and development of English culture in early New York City, she reveals information about the Dutch colony of New Netherland and how the English obtained possession of it, details about New York City's transition from being a culturally Dutch city to being a culturally English city, and the different ways New Yorkers resisted and negotiated the assumed cultural and moral authority of the elites around them, as elites often tried to dictate the culture and morals early New Yorkers should adopt. But first, I've received a bunch of requests to hold meetups in places I haven't yet been able to visit. I'm excited you want to meet up, as I really do enjoy getting to know more about you and your interests. So I wanted to share why I've held meetups in the cities I've held them in, and how we could possibly hold a meetup closer to you. The meetup schedule is determined purely by my conference and speaking schedule. These days, colleges, universities, companies, and other organizations hire me to lead workshops and to speak to their students, employees, members, and local communities about history, podcasting, and my rather unique career path. And I organize meetups based on the speaking schedule. So if you would like to come hear me speak or organize a meetup closer to you, ask your company or any of the organizations you belong to have me out for a custom talk about history and leadership, or to give a workshop on podcasting. Or contact the history department at your local college or university and ask them to bring me out for a talk. And if I can make the dates and events work, I will come out to see you and meet you in person. All right, are you ready to explore the culture of early New York City and how it developed? Let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a professor of history at the University of Denver. She's interested in the history of early American immigrant and ethnic groups, urban religious pluralism, and New England in historical memory. She's the author of 2 books, including Before the Melting Pot, Society and Culture in Colonial New York City, 1664 to 1730, and, most recently, Who Should Rule at Home? Confronting the Elite in British New York City. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Joyce Goodfriend.
Thanks, Liz. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, I'm really excited about today's conversation because Joyce's book, Who Should Rule at Home, offers us the opportunity to explore how the culture and society in New York City formed between 1664 and the American Revolution. Now, colonial New York City is a very interesting place because, unlike the other English colonies on the North American mainland, New York, along with parts of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, started as a Dutch colony called New Netherland. Joyce, I wonder if we could start our conversation with a brief overview of New Netherland. Would you tell us about New Netherland and the culture and demography that developed in this colony?
New Netherland was actually the possession of a Dutch trading company called the Dutch West India Company. And its settlement was essentially controlled through that company. And the population was heterogeneous from the beginning, largely because not that many Dutch people wanted to leave the Netherlands in the early 17th century because this was the so-called golden age of the Netherlands. And so there wasn't a lot of pressure to leave. So other peoples were welcomed, including English, French, Germans. And then, of course, the Dutch institute a very early version of African slavery. And so some of the inhabitants of New Netherland turn out to be of African origins. The primary institution, I would say, other than the government and sort of the military component of the government, was the Dutch Reformed Church. And I would say that even though there was a diverse population, most people were comfortable enough living under what I call a Dutch cultural umbrella. So what we have is a commercially oriented colony under the governance of a trading company with essentially one church, what we call the Dutch Reformed Church, which was under the governance of an ecclesiastical body in Amsterdam called the Amsterdam Classis. I suppose I should also add that there were, in fact, adherents of other religions present in New Netherland, and particularly in New Amsterdam, which I write about, Lutherans, Quakers, and Jews. And there was a very determined Director General of New Netherland named Petrus Stuyvesant. We know him as Peter Stuyvesant. And he tried very hard to enforce the sort of Calvinist version of Protestantism, but toleration became a contested issue, and Stuyvesant, even though he was determined to restrict the religious worship of Lutherans, Quakers, and Jews, ended up in a sort of a contest with more liberal religious thinkers in Amsterdam who were more concerned about the commercial success of the colony than a rigid Calvinist society.
I wonder if you could provide us with more detail about how the governance and leadership of the Dutch West India Company impacted New Netherland. I mean, did this type of governance set it apart from, say, the royal colonies of England and France?
Certainly, there was nothing resembling a representative government, which of course emerges in some of the New England colonies. And of course, the sort of emphasis on trade, I think, has left the impression that New Netherland was geared more toward material wealth than the idealism that is so noteworthy in the Puritan colonies.
Okay, so New Netherland was clearly a distinctive colony in North America, given that it was Dutch. So what happened to this Dutch colony and its culture and society when the English seized New Netherland and declared it an English colony in 1664? Would you tell us about the conquest of New Netherland and about the Articles of Capitulation?
Sure. Probably we should just step back and say the Dutch and the English were in an increasingly intense conflict over trade in Europe with ramifications across the globe, actually. And so there were actually 3 Anglo-Dutch wars in the mid-17th century, and New Netherland's fate was definitely connected to these wars. And so in 1664, an English fleet sailed into the harbor at New Amsterdam and basically asked for the surrender of the colony, and Stuyvesant, given the advice of his leading men, capitulated reluctantly, certainly, but he capitulated without any military action. And the English actually offered extremely generous terms for the surrender, the Articles of Capitulation. It was a very lenient peace, largely because if a more draconian set of rules had been imposed, the English would have been hard-pressed to enforce them, since they were essentially surrounded by a Dutch majority and did not have the means to enforce any settlement that was punitive in nature. So essentially, the Dutch residents were allowed to keep their property, keep their inheritance practices, continue their trade with the Netherlands, and allowed to practice their religion freely and openly. So in essence, what you have in 1664 is a change at the top, a change in government, but really minimal social and cultural change, since the vast majority of the population, even those who were non-Dutch in lineage, had accommodated to the Dutch cultural umbrella. So everybody went on speaking in Dutch and worshiping at the Dutch Reformed Church, and English culture advanced very minimally, given the sort of demographic imbalance with very few Englishmen proportionately in the colonies.
We know New York City today is an English-speaking city, so what changed that New York transitioned from being a culturally Dutch city to being a culturally English colonial city?
I would say that change comes very, very slowly. The advance of English culture and values was slow and didn't penetrate deeply into the social structure. The small number of residents who essentially thought they saw the handwriting on the wall were the wealthy merchants. So they saw opportunity in accommodating the English elite and essentially joining them. And so they're the ones who are first to start learning English, but not all of them love it. We have some interesting examples of resistance to English culture. And most residents of New Netherland, particularly those outside of what becomes New York City, the former New Amsterdam, just go on in their traditional ways. They're essentially unmoved by this change at the top. Remember, communications at this point are very primitive in the sense of being able to reach into the families in the rural areas. They essentially persist in their old ways. So some developments that come later, I think, are more significant in terms of linguistic change.
I remember when I first started digging into the history of New Netherland, so many books said that the English took over New York in 1664, and then it just became an English colony. What most books don't tell us is that the colony actually experienced a second brief period as a Dutch colony after 1664. So Joyce, would you tell us about the Dutch reconquest of New Netherland in 1673?
This is one of the little-known facts of New York City history. I suspect the vast majority of New Yorkers today don't know this. But actually, again, in the context of the three Anglo-Dutch wars in the middle of the 17th century, a Dutch fleet rather opportunistically recaptures New Netherland in 1673. It's not sort of a planned strategy. They just find that they're there and they can do it. The Dutch keep control of the colony for about a year, and then they cede it back to the English in a peace treaty, which is made in Europe in 1674. So what the fate of New Netherland, then New York, then back to what's called New Orange, is controlled really by developments and diplomats in Europe. So a New English regime takes over in 1674 and is a little harsher in its treatment of Dutch leading men and forcing them to proclaim their loyalty to the New English rulers. But the dilemma of the English is still pretty much the same in that they are greatly, greatly outnumbered in terms of the demography, certainly in the rural areas, but also very much so in New York City. So again, governance has changed. A little more is done to change laws to conform to English models, but there is not too much change in society and culture even after 1674.
Joyce has mentioned that New York's cultural transition from Dutch to English was not easy and that it was even a bit contentious at times. And I want us to explore this transition in some detail. But I do think there are two more events that we need to investigate so that we can properly set up the tension that existed between New York City's Dutch and English inhabitants. Okay, so the years between 1664 and 1691 proved to be particularly tumultuous in the history of New York. I mean, not only did the colony change imperial hands 3 times, but in 1689, the Glorious Revolution reached New York and sparked Leisler's Rebellion. Joyce, would you tell us about the Glorious Revolution and Leisler's Rebellion and the connection that existed between these two events?
So the context is a good deal of governmental instability already evident in New York. And accompanying that, I would emphasize cultural uncertainty. In other words, English and Dutch are learning how to coexist on the fly, really. They're just figuring it out and not really having a source of cultural authority that's consistent and that's able to enforce a certain set of values. So the turmoil created by the governmental turnovers that we've talked about intensifies as certain things happen in England with respect to the monarchy. Charles II, the King of England, dies in 1685, and his brother, who is the Duke of York, the person who controls New York colony, becomes King James II. And the problem with that, from the point of view of lots of people in England and lots of people in the colonies, is that James II is a self-declared Catholic. And New Netherland had been a very Protestant society, and England presumably was a Protestant society. And so there is an uproar in England, which comes to be known as the Glorious Revolution, in which governmental leaders, political leaders in England, engineer James's removal from the throne in 1688 and his replacement by William and Mary, people we know well from the name of the college in Virginia today. But this was essentially William of Orange, a Dutch ruler, and Mary, his wife, who was a daughter of James II. So they replaced James II, become the Protestant rulers of England in 1689. And while this is going on, this is a period of great instability and uncertainty transatlantically and in other colonies besides New York. The crisis resonates in New York and spurs, I would call it, a popular anti-Catholic movement led by a merchant named Jacob Leisler, who had roots back to New Netherland, although way back when his roots were in a German state. He was a well-known merchant, and he had a pretty successful career, but he was a rigid Calvinist, and he saw the threat posed by James II, whose wife had recently had a son who was destined to be another Catholic ruler of England. He saw that as just catastrophic for good Protestants in New Netherland, and actually he would have been very happy with restoring New York to Dutch governance. That didn't happen. But while he's in power, and this is the phenomenon known as Leisler's Rebellion, he forcibly removed the English officials who were seen as Catholic sympathizers and their supporters among the colonial elite. And then the tide turns when a new Protestant English governor arrives in 1691, and Jacob Leisler and his comrade Jacob Milborne are publicly executed to the great dismay of many people we would call commoners, regular, ordinary people, most of them Dutch, but not entirely Dutch. So this is a critical event in the colony's history and in New York City's history that really sort of the capstone to the instability and lack of cultural direction of the previous 25 years.
We've now explored several different events in the history of early New York City. The transfer of power in the colony from Dutch to English a couple of times, the Glorious Revolution, and Leisler's Rebellion. And now it seems like we should ask, Joyce, what did these events mean in a cumulative sense for the culture of New York City's inhabitants? I mean, how did these events impact the tensions that existed between New York City's Dutch and English inhabitants?
In the short term, there was a lot of animus on the part of the supporters of Leisler, and New York's politics for a couple of decades remained in this sort of binary opposition between pro and anti-Leislerians. But by the second decade of the 18th century, things calmed down and these sort of animosities generated by Leisler's Rebellion fade away. And the main problem in New York after 1691 is the issue of cultural authority, which is sort of the centerpiece of my book. The English are now firmly in control of New York's government. There are no governmental changes up until, or actually through the Revolution, because the English actually occupied New York City during the American Revolution. So it's not really until 1783 that we see any major governmental change after 1691. So that's important because you do have governmental stability finally established. It takes a long, long time. But again, that does not mean that English values prevail. Certainly not in the rural areas of the colony, which are still almost all majority Dutch, except for a few pockets. And in New York City, which has a heterogeneous population. So the problem for the English is to establish, hopefully by peaceful means, and essentially that's what happens, there's no military action, peacefully establish their cultural authority over the Dutch. And at this point, we have another major ethnic group appear on the scene. These are Huguenot immigrants, French Protestants who have fled Louis XIV's anti-Protestant policy and have sort of had a diaspora over Europe, and some of them end up in the British colonies of America. So we have I would call a multi-pronged cultural effort or cultural initiative on the part of the English to persuade or incentivize, to use a modern term, the acceptance of English values. So I would say there's sort of three prongs to the multi-pronged cultural initiative. One is finally to build and to legally establish a branch of the Church of England in New York City. And this is, of course, the Anglican Church, and the actual church is called Trinity Church, which still exists today. The second is to allow the English Missionary Organization, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, usually known as the SBG, to initiate educational work in New York City and obviously in some of the rural areas as well. Some of this entails teaching and catechizing enslaved Africans as well as poor white children. And interestingly, the famous schoolmaster of the SBG is a Huguenot refugee named Elias No, who is quite successful at bringing Anglican religious values to these peoples. And then thirdly, in the mid-1690s, New York City finally is allowed to have a printing press run by the famous William Bradford, who has become an Anglican supporter. And so most of the products of the press are essentially in line with English values. So all of that is going on, and you have members of the urban elite, Dutch and French, joining with the English, now really seeing the handwriting on the wall as to where the center of power is and beginning to adopt the standards, values, styles of English elites on both sides of the Atlantic. But what really starts going on, and what I think is a major contribution of my book in identifying this, is what I would call a deliberate discursive attack on the Dutch as ignorant and focused largely on the inability of most of them to speak good English. And this is found in a variety of texts and is well documented. The Dutch are singled out on the basis of their ethnicity and portrayed as inferior to the English. Emphasis is placed on their cultural deficits. And this is a deliberate attempt on the part of the English elite to steer the conversation away from religion and specifically from the anti-Catholicism that was the defining motif of the Leislerian movement. The Dutch counter-narrative, which develops in opposition to this, what I call discourse of decline, the Dutch discourse is centered on preserving the true Protestant faith. But the Dutch are demonized by the English, who hold the power, really, and are treated as culturally outsiders. I call this an officially sanctioned campaign against Dutchness, which essentially forces a lot of Dutch people, particularly in the middle ranks of society, off the public stage. But I would argue it does not destroy Dutch culture in New York.
You mentioned that the elite of New York City, the Dutch elite, eventually bought into the English plan to anglicize the culture of New York, and that they played an important role in implementing these cultural changes. Would you help us better understand this point by telling us about the social hierarchy of New York culture and where the Dutch elite fit into this hierarchy?
There are some Dutch guys that essentially decide that being Dutch may be a handicap and being English would be an asset. And so obviously they can't change their lineage, but they change their outlook and their attitude. And they join with men of privilege of both English background and some French background to form what I call in my book a Panethnic Elite. So the old binary conflict between the English and the Dutch is not really accurate to describe what's going on in New York City in the 18th century. Men of privilege of English, Dutch, and French background unite behind what I would call an English cultural front. And they embrace the English code of politeness that underpins gentility, both in England and the American colonies, not just New York. This means they closely follow the styles which we usually call Georgian taste, after the Georges, who will become the monarchs of England by this point in time. They follow Georgian styles invented in England. So one can just tick off several aspects of this sort of cultural transformation. They build and live in beautiful townhomes in the city. And by the way, the city is essentially below Wall Street. It's not what New York City looks like today. The northern part of the island is largely countryside. And then they build country estates in what we might call the Upper East Side today of Manhattan. So they have beautiful townhouses filled with finely crafted possessions, furniture, painting, all sorts of luxury items. They have their portraits painted by increasingly better artists, ultimately including John Singleton Copley in the 1770s. They have libraries with an array of volumes, many of which reflect their Enlightenment-influenced tastes. They stroll around pleasure gardens on the outskirts of the city and have other exclusive gathering places. They have dances, dancing assemblies, wear the finest clothes, the current English fashions, beautiful wigs. There are wig makers called peruke makers who make different variety of wigs for the gentlemen. They have elegant coaches and chariots. And this entire, what we would call genteel lifestyle, is supported by household servants, both indentured servants of European background and enslaved Africans. So they live a very privileged life and cultivate a code of gentility. And the other side of the coin is the vast majority of Newark's population, both black and white, who are expected to defer to these gentlemen and to essentially follow the standards which are set forth by gentlemen and ladies at the top. And these would be the artisans, laborers, indentured servants, slaves, and of course the women and children who live in the households with the patriarchs. So this is essentially the social structure. And of course the argument of my book is that the cultural authority of the Panethnic Elite, which is systematized and refined and propagated throughout the 18th century up to the Revolution, of course, is resisted quietly, individually, but sometimes with a good deal of success by all of these people, artisans, working people, servants, slaves, even women who push back a little bit against the gentleman.
You know, thus far, our conversation has really been about setting the scene for how colonial New York City transitioned from a Dutch city to an English city. I mean, thus far, we've talked about what New York City looked like as a culturally Dutch city and what it looked like culturally and socially at the end of the 17th century and in the early 18th century. So now I think it's time for us to really start digging into the specifics of how the English actually planned to anglicize colonial New York City. Joyce, one of the places you believe that we can clearly see the English campaign to subordinate and maybe even eliminate Dutch culture in New York City is within the debates over language. Specifically, within the debates over whether the dominies or ministers of the Dutch Reformed Church should offer English sermons. So, would you tell us more about this debate over language?
The Dutch Reformed Church is transformed under English rule from the church to one of a few major churches. So this is important. They no longer have the support of the state, but they are allowed to carry on, as we might say. And so what we would call today the class spectrum of the Dutch Reformed congregation is very broad. It includes members of the elite, lots of middling people, and some lower class people, we might say. So in the middle of the 18th century, roughly from the 1740s into the 1770s, a very serious internal conflict develops within the Dutch Reformed congregation. And there's more than one physical church edifice, but when I say congregation, the congregation is administered as one. The Dutch gentlemen, these are members of the city's elite, Dutch gentlemen within the Dutch Reformed Church begin to agitate as early actually as the 1730s, but more definitively in the 1740s, for bringing one English language preacher to New York City. And their argument is that their children, the so-called younger generation, is no longer fluent in Dutch, and this has to do with the language change, certainly at the upper levels of society. And to maintain their allegiance to the Dutch Reformed Church, it seems very reasonable to call one minister, and ministers are called dominies in the Dutch Reformed Church, to give sermons and conduct services in English. Surprisingly, at least to us today, because it sounds like a non-issue, obviously there's a need for communication to be understood, there's actually a very spirited opposition to what we can call this elite initiative to bring an English language preacher. A faction composed mostly of artisans and laborers and their wives believe very strongly that their faith can only be expressed, articulated, communicated in the Dutch language. They make a connection, which is a connection made by other traditional groups that don't rock the boat. We've always been hearing our sermons in Dutch. We need to continue doing that. And so for several decades, there was a back and forth because these people, many of them are actual communicants, full church members, do have a voice in church governance. Certainly not the majority voice, but they do count. And eventually takes a long time until the mid-1760s, this faction, the opposition faction, the Dutch language faction, is defeated. And a man named Archibald Laidley, who actually turned out to be a Scotsman who had preached for a while in the Netherlands, was called to be New York City's first English-speaking minister. And he arrives to great audience, and his inaugural sermon is in English in 1764, and he receives widespread praise. But keep in mind, there are two other Dutch ministers at this time in the city, and they continue preaching in Dutch. So it's not as if the Dutch language is overnight superseded by Archibald English preaching. Archibald Laidley is very successful, and within a few years, another English-speaking minister, John Henry Livingston, is called, and a new church building, the North Church, is built to accommodate English language worship. But the Dutch faction really doesn't give up. In a number of ways, they push back, and one of the ways I would like to briefly mention is that they keep reading Dutch books. This is a surprising discovery in my research that well into the 18th century, as late as the 1760s, New York's printers are printing Dutch books, and New York's merchants and booksellers are importing Dutch titles from the Netherlands. So the sort of maintenance of the Dutch language by ordinary people. The elite, of course, has given up on the Dutch language, but some printers are even putting Dutch language items in their newspapers, including the famous John Peter Zenger, who actually is of German heritage, but was a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, and another Dutch language preacher, Henricus de Forest. You will find lots of Dutch books, mostly on religious subjects, but also some Dutch almanacs. And this is sort of the bedrock of the oppositional Dutch culture. These people in the church are reading Dutch books, praying in Dutch, and loving the Dutch language preachers. So by the eve of the Revolution, you find 4 Dutch ministers in New York City, 2 who preach in English and 2 who preach in Dutch.
Now, in addition to the debate over Dutch or English sermons, which took place within the Dutch Reformed Church, people also experience similar cultural debates and changes inside their own homes. And after a brief conversation about our listener survey, we're going to explore some of these domestic debates and changes. The Omohundro Institute and I are still running our listener survey, and we're hoping we can convince you to spare us just a few minutes of your time to share your feedback with us. The OI and I have put together the survey because we want to get to know more about you and hear what you think about the show. Because after all, Ben Franklin's World exists for you. The OI and I want you to enjoy discovering more about early American history each and every week, and doing that in the most enjoyable, effective, and sustainable way possible is our number one priority. That's why I'm asking you for a big favor. Can you please spare me just a few minutes of your time to complete our online survey? It really doesn't take more than just a few minutes to complete. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/survey and share your thoughts with us. Please note that your participation will really help us keep the show fresh and available for download every Tuesday. Plus, everyone who completes the survey will be entered into a drawing for signed copies of some really great books about early American history. Again, our survey is available at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. Thank you so much for your help with this. I really look forward to hearing from you. Joyce, earlier you described for us what elite households in New York City look like in terms of their furnishings and construction. But how are these households structured? And how are the households of non-elite New Yorkers structured? Would you tell us about how families were structured and how these structures experience cultural change too?
here's where New York really doesn't deviate that much from other early American colonies. There's a patriarchal model of family life, sort of legitimized in English common law, and males are the heads of households, and everybody else in the household, including wives, children, servants, and slaves, are expected to follow the dictates of the patriarch. But under certain circumstances, and this varied, patriarchs do prove vulnerable to the efforts made by their dependents to challenge their authority. So, for example, we find wives who are feeling that the edict to behave submissively given out by husbands who often turn out to be abusive or indifferent or just cold can be resisted. By the way, the husbands do have, within certain bounds, the power to enforce their rules by beating their wives. And so there are episodes of wife beating in New York, as there are in other colonies. But anyway, a small minority of wives, mostly in middling families, not in the elite, and we just don't really know about people really at the bottom of the social scale. But quite a few middling wives actually leave their husbands. They run away out of either desperation or possibly desire to be with another man. Historians call this self-divorce because divorce is almost a legal impossibility at this point in time. And you'd say, well, how could we possibly know about this phenomenon? We know about it because their husbands often put advertisements in the local newspapers announcing that they would no longer be responsible for their wives' bed and board. And once in a blue moon, we find some evidence from the wives' side, which show that they don't just roll over and play dead and remain passive, that they do figure out ways to resist the authority of males at the head of the household.
So, in what ways do you think that these wives' resistance to their husband's patriarchal authority was influenced by the greater cultural conflict that took place in New York City during the 18th century?
I wouldn't say any tension between English and Dutch. I wouldn't say it certainly was significant. I mean, it might have been important in a few cases. I would say it'd be more likely that some tension might arise. I mean, other than tensions over personality or things like that. I would say that one of the ways in which wives become more independent, not necessarily to the extent of running away, but become more independent, is through religion. It's important just to note briefly that a very famous and charismatic evangelical preacher named George Whitefield came to New York starting in 1739, and I think his last visit was in the early 1770s, preaching the new birth. He was a very effective evangelical preacher who had a major impact in other parts of the colonies. In New York, his impact was delayed. So it's not really until he comes in 1764 that we can say that New York, contrary to earlier historical scholarship, at least what I've read, I think we need to recognize him as spurring what we can call a religious revival in the city. The city at this time is only about 22,000 people. It's not huge by any means, but in his wake, New York adds to the number of congregations, and by 1771, there are 18 different congregations in New York. And so there's opportunity to choose a faith that is meaningful to an individual. And in this context, women become what I've called in a broader sense religious consumers. And there's quite a bit of shifting from one church to another. In the book, I talk briefly about the appeal of a fairly exotic sect called the Moravians. This is a pietistic sect. And this sect, which has its headquarters in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but there is a Moravian church established in New York City in the early 1750s, attracts a lot of women. A lot of women are also attracted to the Methodists who come to preach in the wake of George Whitefield's endeavors. So I think there are probably multiple sources for women pushing back against male authority. But in one important way, the emphasis of Whitefield on the new birth and the emergence of what I would call religious consumerism in New York City emboldened quite a few women to strike out on their own, at least in the spiritual realm.
If religion helped many middling women decide that they could push back on patriarchal authority, did anything help enslaved people and servants who often lived in elite people's households? Did anything help them push back against patriarchal and elite authority?
We find parallel phenomena in the case of both servants and slaves. Indentured servants were men and women who came mostly from England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and probably from the German states as well. They were under what we would call temporary labor contracts. You almost always single people in their teens and 20s. They push back rather frequently. Some of them run away. Some of them challenge the power, the authority of their masters in court cases. So there's quite a bit of evidence of pushback from servants. But the more interesting case is the ways in which enslaved men and women who lived in the households of not just elite New Yorkers, but many middling New Yorkers as well, had the financial ability to buy human beings, to buy enslaved men and women. And these people really struggled to resist. Now, New York is known as the site of some quite famous episodes of mass resistance, collective resistance, the 1712 slave rebellion and the 1741 alleged slave conspiracy, and those have been written about to a great extent already. So I don't focus on those. I actually focus on the rather mundane, everyday ways in which enslaved people push toward a degree of autonomy or independence. There's a case of an enslaved female worker named Belinda who lived in the household of a very well-to-do merchant named John Watts. And she was his cook. And apparently from the documents, and we have his letter book, so we have a lot of documentation, she was a fabulous cook. He valued her very, very highly. But she started to do what we might call a form of magic, to what he called trifle with charms. And this was interpreted by him as a violation of the English cultural norms that he insisted on enforcing in his household. So he reluctantly sold her, essentially kicked her out of his household, even though he loved her meals. But from her point of view, she's an interesting person to think about, because even living in a very hierarchically structured household and with a very privileged family, she was able to carve out some time and presumably a little place to engage in her traditional religious rituals. The rest of the Watts family were devout Anglicans. She could not accept that, apparently, and Mr. Watts could not tolerate her deviance. But this is an interesting case study of a woman who essentially stuck to her guns and suffered as a result of it. There were extreme measures that enslaved people took to resist domination by their masters. These include running away, which is, of course, very familiar, and very sadly, infanticide, killing babies, not bringing them into a world of slavery, even some cases of suicide. But I think the measures that I would emphasize are the deliberate steps that enslaved people took to carve out mental space, to separate themselves from their everyday roles, to reinvent kinship networks, since they were essentially prevented from legally marrying. They created families that were not recognized necessarily by the law, but meant a great deal to them. And then, of course, they tap into what I would call the liberating potential of Christianity, probably the best example, but not the only one, being the Methodists who arrive and welcome them into their meetings.
From our conversation, it really seems like early New York City was a place dealing with a lot of different resistance. First, there was the cultural and political resistance of the Dutch to the English. Then there was the resistance to linguistic change in the Dutch Reformed Church. There was resistance to other religions, resistance between the sexes, and the resistance common people used to challenge the cultural and moral authority of the elite. So now I have to wonder, was there any other type of resistance in colonial New York City that we haven't explored and should explore?
I think there's probably one more type of resistance that I might mention. This would be the kind of resistance engaged in by people who are really desperate, poor people, people who are living outside the law, either stealing or engaging in prostitution. And these were people who did not want to conform to the expectations of the philanthropic people in their midst, the people who dispensed charity, who expected behavioral conformity in return. And there are some episodes, I would say, of semi-violence or breaking the laws, carrying on in ways that were considered deviant, just to say, we don't care what you do to us, we're going to live according to our own lights. There is an interesting example of ordinary people going up to the country estate of a very, very prominent New Yorker named Nicholas Bayard and damaging his property and his animals, mainly because they felt they didn't have enough to eat. So there is a kind of edginess to the protests of people who are really at the very bottom of the social scale and don't want to behave in a sycophantic way to the dispensers of charity. So they really act out, and they're worth considering as well.
So, taking the 30,000-foot big picture view of all the records you've looked at in relation to colonial New York City, early New Yorkers, and all the tensions that face this city and people, is there anything about the history of early New York City that can tell us about how New York emerged as the distinctly American city we know it as today?
I think probably the best way to look at what I write about in my book, which is mostly about New York between the very late 17th century and the onset of the American Revolution in 1776, is as a prelude to more widespread challenges to elite authority that accompany the American Revolution and come after the American Revolution. There is no organized movement of people in New York in the 18th century, in British New York City, who say, now we're going to stand up for our rights. This is a much more individualized and non-ideological kind of opposition, I would say, to elite cultural authority, which results in multiple contests, each of which on their own is not that significant or earth-shaking. But taken together, you see a pattern of behavior in which the authority of the elite is challenged and requires members of the elite, and this is almost all white males, requires these gentlemen to think about how to ensure peaceful coexistence with all of the people who depend on them. Long term, I would say the challenges to elite authority are a prelude to much more widespread, more intense, more sustained, occasionally more violent confrontations between privileged and powerful men. I'm talking now about the 19th century and maybe even into the 20th century. Confrontations between the privileged and an increasingly diverse population that includes immigrants of varied ethnic and religious backgrounds, and of course, people of color who are no longer confined to slavery. And the heart of all of this, which is probably the one constant, is that New York City, from its very beginnings, was a pluralistic society, and as such contained the seeds of differences that could erupt into cultural contests at any point. And that may be a theme in New York history that goes well beyond the 17th and 18th centuries.
Let's jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened to the culture and development of New York City society if the Dutch had held on to New York at the end of that Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1674? Do you think the Dutch would have imposed a cultural campaign to Batavianize or Dutchify the English? And how do you think the city's cultural development would have been different?
I actually thought about this, and it seems to me, at least I suspect, that in the short term, and I'm not quite sure how long the short term is, but let's say for the next century or so, I think the city might have developed roughly along the same lines as it did under the English. And the reason I say that is both England and the Netherlands were commercially oriented Protestant powers striving to build global empires. So that they were actually quite similar. New York was an exceptionally valuable port city that people, leaders in Europe, whether in Amsterdam or London, would have protected and promoted. Trade, economic development, I think, would have been prioritized over any efforts to ensure doctrinal purity. And so the religious toleration that does develop in New York City under British rule, I'm sure would have developed under Dutch rule as well. It was already developing in Amsterdam. And I think just the incredible variety of New York and the great wealth would have encouraged great minds to flourish, whether it was a Dutch city or an English city, and of course later an American city. There are, and I have to say this parenthetically, there are people whom I would call, including scholars, whom I would call Dutch apologists, and they seek to make connections between 17th and 18th century New York City and late 20th century and early 21st century, the metropolis of our times. And I think that's foolhardy. This really was a different world. But certainly for the period under which the English held power in New York up through the American Revolution, that century, I think there would have been more similarities between a Dutch ruled city and an English ruled city than dissimilarities. And I'm sure people won't agree with that, but I think that's my opinion.
You're a scholar who's best known for their work on the cultural and religious history of New Netherland and early New York City. And I wonder, are you going to continue with this type of research, or is your next project taking you somewhere else?
Actually, I'm being a renegade and moving away from New York. I'm currently working on a new project which deals with historical memory, which is a subject I've written about in a couple of essays which are geared to the New York context. But I'm actually researching historical memory in Vermont. So this is totally different from my previous work. So I'm going to give you a very tentative title for my project. I'm sure it will change, but I'm just become increasingly fascinated with the field of historical memory studies and also with a very different sort of rural-oriented society in Vermont. So the working title is Remembering Vermont, The Journey Toward an Inclusive Past. So stay tuned.
How can we contact you if we have more questions about early New York City and its culture?
Well, you can certainly reach me at my email at joyce.goodfriend@du.edu. That's the University of Denver. If you Google me, you can probably find a lot of stuff that I've done and have been thinking about and working on. So I look forward to anybody who would like to communicate.
Joyce Goodfriend, thank you for helping us explore some of the cultural history of early New York City.
Oh, you're quite welcome. It's been my pleasure.
New York City has always been a pluralistic society. It has always contained the seeds of cultural conflict and differences that could erupt at any point. And we just heard about some of these eruptions in our conversation with Joyce. During the mid to late 17th century, most New Yorkers were not pleased with the English takeover of their colony. They enjoyed speaking Dutch, worshiping in the Dutch Reformed Church, and trading according to Dutch practices. But then, the English came in 1664 and started introducing English culture. Now, at first, the English weren't too pushy with imposing their culture because they had no real way to exert or enforce their cultural and moral authority. The Dutch populace of New York City outnumbered its English residents by a lot. But after 1674, the English launched what Joyce has come to call a deliberate discursive attack against Dutch culture. After losing control of New York between 1673 and 1674, and then witnessing Dutch resistance to English authority during Leisler's Rebellion, the English government and its officers denounced the Dutch as backwards and cultureless, and they launched a three-pronged campaign to institute English values and culture in New York City. First, they established the Church of England to weaken the moral authority in place of the Dutch Reformed Church in New York City society. Then, they allowed the English Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts to establish schools where poor whites and enslaved people had opportunities to learn about the Anglican faith and the English language and culture. Finally, they established a printing press in the 1690s, which, for a time, only printed English language news and works. With this three-pronged effort, the English created the framework from which they could exert their moral, cultural, and linguistic authority to establish a new culture for New York City. Of course, this effort also created the conditions by which all New Yorkers could resist. They resisted the institution of English sermons in their churches, they resisted the cultural and moral authority of their masters, and they resisted the patriarchal authority of their husbands and fathers. As Joyce noted, there was never a large uprising to resist cultural change, but there were many individual efforts to negotiate the types of culture and social norms that New York City would follow. And this negotiation is something that happens even in our own time. Just think about how we respond to all the fashions designers want us to adopt in our clothing and home furnishings. The politics and religions our friends, family, and neighbors would like us to support. And in the ways we communicate with each other, via the language we use and how we use that language, in person, on the phone, or on the different social media networks we've joined or choose to join. Culture is both highly individualistic and local, and yet also all-encompassing and society-wide. Culture informs why we act the way we do, and when we explore it in historical contexts, culture can even tell us who we are and how we came to be who we are. Look for more information about Joyce, her book, Who Should Rule at Home, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/185. Please help me out by taking my listener survey. All the feedback you provide will help inform the show and its development. You can take the survey on any internet-connected device by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/survey. Finally, in what ways do you think the culture of your community and place has informed your outlook and sense of who you are? Personally, I know my upbringing in New England and the opportunities I've had to live in other parts of the United States has greatly informed my sense of who I am and how I think about things, as has my work and training as a historian. So, has your travel and place of residence impacted your outlook? Let me know. Send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.